You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I'm the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament. I've been a Member of Parliament nearly 18 years, and I think it just goes to show what a multicultural and multi-faith society that we are becoming. Well, I have always been passionate about exports. The biggest problem that we have as a nation is that although we are the sixth largest economy in the world, we are only the 12th largest exporter. As a trade envoy, incentivizing and reaching out to SMEs to export to exciting jurisdictions like many African countries.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Daniel Kawczynski, who is a British MP and has served as a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and a special advisor to former Prime Minister David Cameron, and is currently one of the Prime Minister's trade envoys. Welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And I very much look forward to the next hour or so when we discuss Africa.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to it. So I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast before, but I usually like to get started from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Daniel Kawczynski.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm the first ever Polish-born British Member of Parliament. So
wow.
We came to this country in 1978 when I was 6 years of age. My parents were fiercely anti-communist, and they refused to live in a totalitarian society. So we left, and it was a tremendous wrench for me as a child to leave my homeland and to come to the United Kingdom as a foreigner and to start from scratch. I have to say, though, that I'm very proud that despite having a foreign surname and coming from overseas, that the people of Shrewsbury have voted me to be their representative in Parliament for the fifth time in a row now. This is my fifth term of office. I've been a Member of Parliament for nearly 18 years, and I think it just goes to show what a multicultural and multi-faith society we are becoming here in the United Kingdom. It's a tremendous advantage for us that we have people from all over the world who have chosen to live and settle in the United Kingdom. And I certainly utilize and engage with the Polish diaspora, which is 900,000 strong now in the United Kingdom, to make sure that we are harnessing that interest in promoting bilateral ties with Poland. Because let's not forget, we are hybrids. When you've been born in one country and you've spent your entire life in another, you are a hybrid. You love two countries. You're loyal to two countries. And of course, instinctively, you want to promote and nurture the bilateral relations between the United Kingdom and the country of your origin. And that's a very important thing that I do as a politician. And I very much hope that's something that we can encourage more people of African origin who are living in the United Kingdom to follow me into politics and to become engaged with our political system. Because it's only when we have more people of African origin here in the House of Commons, and I'm speaking to you from my office in the House of Commons, it's only when we get and incentivize and motivate more British people of African origin to become involved in politics that we can really start to generate the sort of interest in Africa, which is commensurate with the size and potential strategic importance of this partner for the United Kingdom.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Your story definitely does resonate with me. You've given us great insights into your childhood moving from Poland to the UK and your journey into politics and trade. So talking about politics, you're currently a British MP, which you've detailed in your intro, and you're one of the Prime Minister's trade envoys. Can you tell us what your role as a trade envoy is and what it involves?
Well, I have always been passionate about exports because I used to work in exports before I became a member of parliament. And I think the biggest problem that we have as a nation is that although we are the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, we are only the 11th or 12th largest exporter. So our ability to export is not commensurate with the size of our economy. And that inevitably has led to a significant balance of payments deficit. We have run a deficit in our trade for many, many years. And that, of course, has an impact on our economy. Many small businesses in the United Kingdom take advantage of the fact that the United Kingdom has such a large internal market. So they think to themselves, what's the point of exporting to Congo, for example, when I can sell my product here internally within the United Kingdom? What's the point of taking the risk in currency fluctuations or difficulties with transport and logistics of sending something or trying to find a customer in Tanzania when I can just sell it up the road or to another part of the United Kingdom? And I spent a year interviewing about 250 SMEs who I interviewed from all over the United Kingdom to understand why they weren't exporting. And I wrote a paper which I presented to the Department of International Trade. And you'll be pleased to know that they implemented about 80 to 85% of my recommendations.
Oh, wow.
But we still have a problem that we don't have enough SMEs exporting overseas. And that's why, this podcast is so important, because it is only through government incentives and lowering of taxation and tariffs and barriers, and actually proactively as a trade envoy, incentivizing and reaching out to SMEs to export to exciting jurisdictions like many African countries, that we will actually create the prosperity that this country needs. We've been running a budget deficit for many years. The only way that we can start to pay for ourselves rather than borrowing money is by a renaissance in global trading from British companies. And that's what I'm really keen to talk about. So a trade envoy is appointed to a certain jurisdiction. In my case, it's Mongolia and Uzbekistan. And I focus on, actually, if you look at Mongolia, it has some of the largest mineral deposits in the world.
Yes.
The biggest investment in that country is a $14 billion Rio Tinto investment in a copper mine. We are bringing British expertise in processing, and this is critical. Rather than just buying raw materials, the next stage of a partnership is actually technology transfer. It's actually bringing British know-how and expertise to jurisdictions like Mongolia, which allow them to process their raw materials into much more economically important products, finished products, which then gives a win-win scenario for both the United Kingdom and that country. So we are working on at the moment on £2 billion worth of export opportunities to Mongolia in the mining sector. And a lot of my time is spent involved in that. But of course, the African trade envoys, and there are only a handful of them. One of my concerns is that I'm very pleased we have a trade envoy program. Each trade envoy reports directly to the Prime Minister, but there are only a handful of trade envoys to Africa. And that trade envoy program needs to be expanded because we are seeing a lot of interest from African nations who are proactively wanting to see what opportunities there are for bilateral trade with the United Kingdom, now that going forward, we are going to be potentially able to offer a very different offering to that of the European Union.
Thank you for that. So you've detailed your long interest in trade, given us an overview of the UK's trade environment and also the positives of trade. And you also detailed in terms of your role as a trade envoy is to engage with the respective markets where you see or the government sees substantial trade and investment opportunities. So, as this is the Unlocking Africa podcast, which African markets has the UK government identified as having huge trade and investment opportunities?
Well, there are trade envoys historically for countries like, for example, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, the North African nations. There are trade envoys to those North African nations. Kenya, there's a trade envoy for Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Uganda, and also for Nigeria. And South Africa, the obvious ones are there. But in reality, some trade envoys are looking after 2 or 3 nations, whereas I think that given the importance of African countries, it should be just one dedicated trade envoy for one country. I'm not happy with the fact that there's a trade envoy for Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda combined, particularly bearing in mind that there are significant difficulties at the moment between Rwanda and Congo. And I am urging the Prime Minister to make sure that a country the size of Congo, when you think about it, Congo is the size of Western Europe. It is sitting on the next generation. The future is all to do with minerals and rare earth minerals. And whether it's creating batteries for magnets, for batteries, for wind turbines, or whether it's for electric cars or mobile phones, minerals are becoming increasingly important. And yet we see many African nations like Congo being exploited by the Chinese. And I don't want to be overtly critical of our competitors, but I have to be. We see reports about child labor in Congo, that some mines are utilizing children and pregnant women. And I'm appalled at the way what we read about how certain Chinese and Russian companies are exploiting the Congolese people. The only way we're going to compete with that Chinese offering is by going to countries like Congo, engaging with their governments, bringing in processing industries so that we're not just taking raw materials at rock bottom prices. We're not just taking raw materials away and exploiting people, but we're actually bringing in technology to help to process these materials with the real value add then flows from that, creating bilateral joint venture operations, and actually also freeing up our markets to exports, tariff-free. Now, let me just give you an example. The European Union is, I would argue, a protectionist racket. It imposes massive tariffs on things that it wants to protect its own industries. So, for example, there are very few tariffs for coffee. Why? Because we can't grow coffee in the European Union. Massive tariffs for roasted coffee, designed to protect the inefficient coffee roasting industries of Germany and Italy. I would rather slash, now that we're outside of the European Union, we don't have coffee roasting industries in the United Kingdom. I would rather buy my roasted coffee directly from the Kenyans. Let them have the extraordinary value add that comes from processing raw materials and give them tariff-free access to these products. That would send the clearest possible signal to African governments that we are not going to rely upon mere aid for our bilateral relations. We're not going to just throw a few crumbs off our table in terms of aid and think that that's it, we've done our duty and move on. No, aid is inconsequential. It's just peanuts compared to what a country can get if it has tariff-free access to an economy of our size. Another example I would use is oranges. In the past, we've had to protect Spanish orange growers, or we've had to protect Greek olive producers. All of these things we don't produce in the United Kingdom. So I would rather buy my oranges directly from Congo, but tariff-free. There is no point in us having tariffs on products like oranges. And in fact, if we reduce these tariffs, we will be ultimately reducing costs for our end consumers in the supermarkets. Now, we have a cost of living crisis in this country with very high inflation, and many people are struggling to feed themselves. What better way of reducing prices by actually reducing tariffs on products that we can't produce or grow in the United Kingdom? And that way we can play our part, not only in encouraging African nations to export to the United Kingdom, but ultimately to reduce prices in the supermarket for end consumers.
Thank you. You've raised some very interesting points there, Daniel. So you highlighted the importance of your work or the work of your colleagues as trade envoys and dedicating and prioritizing each African market and whereby creating tariff-free access to the UK market. So going back a bit, in early 2020, the UK government were positioning the UK to be, I believe it was the investment partner of choice for African businesses and governments. Do you believe this is still the case?
Well, I am, as a result of your interest, I can pay tribute to you now on this podcast, but as a result of your interest, it's motivated me to start to write a paper here in the House of Commons in conjunction with the House of Commons Library.
Brilliant.
Which we're going to be writing over the next 3 months. It's going to be an assessment of where we are to date in terms of reducing tariffs and what the government intends to do to further reduce tariffs and free up access to African products here in the United Kingdom. But it's not just a question of products, it's also a question of work permits and actually allowing and incentivizing Africans to come and work and contribute in the United Kingdom, start up joint venture operations. That's what I want to do. Now, let me tell you this. The system that we were under was pure racism. It's very controversial what I'm going to say, and I get criticized for it. I stand by it and I believe in it unequivocally. We lived in a system for 50 years where we gave automatic access to white Europeans, our fellow Europeans, free movement of people. We've had, so if you're a Polish person or a Czech or Spanish or Italian, as a member of the European Union, you crossed our border, no questions asked, don't need to show any documents, just wade through and you have automatic access to our NHS and to our education system and all the rest of it. If you're an African, no. You're going to have a much higher fence to jump over in order to get across our frontier. Now, I have no interest in your skin color. I have no interest in your religion. I have no interest where you are from. All I care about is what are your skill sets and can you convince a British entity to employ you, either in the private sector or public sector. I want every single individual, be they Portuguese or Angolan, be they Australian or American, be they Ethiopian or Mauritanian. I want everybody to be assessed crossing that border on their skill sets. And I very much hope that your listeners will recognize for a moment how unjust the previous system was and how disadvantageous it was for Africans in comparison with Europeans. And one of the greatest things that I rejoice about now that we have left the European Union is that we will be able to, and I am pressing my own government on this every week in asking questions on this in the House of Commons, but we're moving towards a point-based system. And I want the entrepreneur from Congo to have no more difficulties with our Home Office, with our regulations, with our visa and employment programs than any European, because the only way we're going to really forge links with Africa is by giving African entrepreneurs the same opportunities and incentives that we do to our fellow Europeans. That is absolutely critical if we're going to form a genuine, mutually respectful, win-win relationship with our African neighbors.
I agree with a lot of the points that you've raised there. And also at the beginning, you mentioned that you're writing a paper focusing on where the UK government is with reducing tariffs within the UK post-Brexit. And I know in October 2022, you introduced a debate on UK relations with the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I was wondering, why did you decide to highlight specifically the UK's relationship with DRC?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and I'm very grateful to you for it. We are at the moment, we have a terrible problem here in the United Kingdom where we've had 45,000 people crossing the channel illegally this year. As you know, it's the busiest waterway in the world.
Yes.
With huge containers passing through a very narrow straits. And yet we have these dinghies coming from France, and there have been recently even fatalities where people have fallen out of these dinghies. And we've got a real problem here in the sense that we cannot seem to get to grips with dealing with the criminal gangs who are smuggling people across the English Channel. It's creating a certain amount of concern amongst the British electorate, and they want us to find a solution. Of course, we want to give access to asylum seekers and people who are fleeing persecution. But one thing we don't want is we don't want for criminal gangs to have an unfettered ability to make millions of pounds from illegally smuggling people into our country. The government's attitude is, well, the only way we're going to deal with this is by sending everybody who comes across in that way to Rwanda for processing. And ultimately, those people who enter the United Kingdom illegally will be sent to Rwanda, which is a Commonwealth country. Now, this is the particular issue. How do we treat Commonwealth countries in comparison to non-Commonwealth countries? Do we give a disproportionate favor to Commonwealth countries to the detriment of non-Commonwealth countries? It's a very interesting debate, and it really needs to be scrutinized and challenged very, very effectively here in the House of Commons. Because I would argue, listening to my Congolese friends, and again, this is controversial, but I have to say it, but I would argue that the allegations from our Congolese friends are that Rwanda is supporting M23 terrorists that are destabilizing the northeastern part of Congo. And I feel very uncomfortable entering into a relationship with Rwanda to be sending these illegal immigrants to that country for processing when we have such strong accusations of killings, mass killings, torture of Congolese citizens in northeast Congo. And I have said to my own Home Secretary, as long as there are these allegations being made, then I will not support a policy of sending illegal immigrants to Rwanda for processing, as long as there are these allegations from Congo. Let's not forget, Congo is probably one of the most strategically important nations in Africa. And we have a terrible paucity, a dearth of engaging with French-speaking Francophone nations. We need to demonstrate to Francophone African nations that we are as serious about them and want to have the same levels of trade with them that we do with Commonwealth countries, and that we will not discriminate against non-Commonwealth countries simply because we are in a partnership with Commonwealth countries, particularly if there are tensions between those two different types of entities.
You've raised a very interesting point there regarding how we treat Commonwealth countries and Francophone countries within Africa. So what measures are the government taking to increase, say, British representation and engagement with Francophone countries in Africa, I guess, in a post-Brexit context?
Well, one of the biggest problems that we make is that we perceive Francophone countries to be in the French sphere of influence. They're not. And my experience of visiting Francophone countries is that they are very cognizant of the sort of monopolistic system that France has, to a certain degree, imposed on them. When I visited Mauritania some 10 years ago for the first time. I visited Mauritania 3 times. Nouakchott, the country I know and am interested in particularly. Would you believe, when I visited Mauritania, I was the first British member of parliament to visit Nouakchott.
Oh, interesting.
In 35 years.
Wow.
And I got to know the president extremely well. His son ultimately ended up working in my office in the House of Commons. But it's just amazing how little is known. If I was to say to most people here in the United Kingdom, oh, Mauritania, they wouldn't even know what I'm talking about. And there's so little understanding about these Francophone countries. And yet when you go to Nouakchott, they are desperate not to be so over-dependent on France and China. And they are reaching out to us, wanting that investment, wanting that bilateral trade. Now, it's easier for me because I studied French at university. So I speak the language. But in actual fact, when you go to Mauritania, nobody wants to speak to you in French because they want to practice their English. So I hardly ever use my French when I go to Mauritania because, as I say, all the discussions take place in English. What I'm trying to say there is, again, Mauritania has been very badly abused, I would argue, by the European Union that has signed agreements whereby it has literally hoovered up the vast majority of Mauritanian fish. These contracts are signed with the European Union. I've spent a lot of time with small fishermen on the coast near Nouakchott, struggling to make a living. And yet the European Union sent these massive vessels to hoover up all the fish in Mauritania. Again, it's that issue of exploitation. Too many times we are seeing, even today in 2023, a sort of post-neo-colonial type of relationship, whereby an African nation is given peanuts either by the European Union or by China, resources are exploited, and in certain cases, child labor is exploited. And one thing that really angers us here in the United Kingdom is when children are exploited. I saw a film recently when I was watching children working in mines in Congo, small Congolese children. It is probably the most unchristian thing that you can come across, exploiting children. And that's why, we have such an opportunity to say to African nations, we want a different type of relationship. We want a relationship which recognizes that we are both equal partners and that we want to create a win-win scenario so that we are maximizing commercial benefits for both sides rather than exploiting and maltreating African resources and African children.
So you've detailed the willingness of Francophone countries wanting to do business with the UK, and also, I guess, something which is a bit of a touchy subject, the relationship between the EU and Francophone countries. So I guess if we look at the UK government's perspective or approach, do you believe the UK government's approach to how it engages with Africa has evolved over the decades?
It's a very, very difficult question to answer. And of course, I'm from the generation where, I speak to you as a 50-year-old. So I was born in 72, which is only 10 years or 15 years after many African nations received their independence. I mean, our parents lived, it's almost impossible to understand now, but our parents lived, actually, in reality, even Zimbabwe, as you know, was, in my view, neo-colonial until 1980, when it was still run by a minority whites and Rhodesia, who tried to cling on to power. Ian Smith and his gang. I mean, it's extraordinary. But in my lifetime, there was still, when I was born, there was still neo-colonial tendencies whereby African nations were manipulated and exploited by Western countries. Now, it's difficult to really sum up the shame that my generation feel. And you hear or you read in books about, in Congo in particular, how the Belgians and King Leopold treated Congolese people. It's very, very difficult to try to explain to young people today who are in their teens and 20s. The perception from my generation is one of still genuine, I think, certainly from intellectual classes, a sense of guilt that this could have happened. And I think the only way that we can actually move on to a new relationship is by proactively demonstrating that as Africa, again, is slowly, unfortunately, falling into a quasi-colonial era with the way in which the Chinese are exploiting resources, the only way that we can actually atone for our mistakes in the past, and the only way that we can actually build a certain level of confidence and trust from the Africans, because this is the key thing. If I was African and I had read the history of what had happened to Africa, I would be skeptical. And it would take a lot of convincing for me to be confident that a Western industrialist or a Western entity was genuinely interested in the partnership. It's only this radical new approach that I think will potentially get an interest from African nations. That's why I'm writing a paper at the moment, which you will get a copy of. And I'd be very keen, once it's published, to come back on your podcast to talk about it. But also, it's actively starting to demonstrate that we are bringing the universities, we're bringing the technical colleges, we're bringing the engineering capability, we're bringing the digital capability in order to form partnerships with African nations. And of course, what the key thing that we have to remember here is interdependence. I am writing a book at the moment. I've spent the last 2 years, would you believe, writing a book entitled Emotional Intelligence in Politics. Now, you might think that as being an oxymoron, but emotional intelligence is a critical. I've been studying emotional intelligence for the last few years with my EQ mentor. She used to teach emotional intelligence to senior air vice marshals. And we're writing a book. We've been writing a book together over the last 2 years, interviewing various senior politicians cross-party to gain their understanding of emotional intelligence and how they've utilized it in their day-to-day lives. A key word of emotional intelligence, one that keeps cropping up over and over again, is interdependence. Interdependence is an essential plank of emotional intelligence. And we don't have anything like the appropriate interdependence between Africa and Europe. And let me give you an example. The huge crisis in the Mediterranean, where many people are drowning every day. As we speak now, as I speak to you now, there are people on rubber dinghies who are crossing from Libya to Lampedusa, who have trekked across the Sahara from Niger, from Mali, from Burkina Faso, from Mauritania. They've gone across the Sahara Desert, and they have gone in little boats in order to seek work in Africa. Many of them die in the process. And then the way they are treated by the Europeans is an absolute disgrace. Many of them face racism and abuse. Many of them are exploited. Many of them are forced to go into prostitution. It's barbarism on an industrial scale. And as long as Africans are being treated in this way, and as long as politicians are going to allow African people to be treated in this way, what sort of a signal does that send to African governments and to African people? And even more importantly, what sort of a signal does that send to British citizens of African origin? It has to stop. It wouldn't be tolerated. If these were Europeans going through this sort of misery and harm, it wouldn't be tolerated. So why should it be tolerated? Because they're Africans. The only way we're going to really start to deal with this issue is by making sure that that prosperity, and rather than just, as I say, crumbs off the table. By the way, I'm very proud that the United Kingdom sends more in international aid than France and Italy combined. Our budget of £18 billion a year is much more generous than France and Italy, but it's still peanuts. It's peanuts. £18 billion spread across the whole of the world is nothing when it comes to international aid. And there are calls from some of my colleagues to cut the aid budget because of the economic crisis here in the United Kingdom. No, that is not the answer. Of course, we should continue to send international aid, but we've got to create the sort of level of economic prosperity in countries like Niger, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and that whole part of Africa, so that people are not forced to leave their homes and make dangerous treks of this kind, risking their lives and the lives of their children to try to seek a better life in Africa. This interdependence between our continent, the sooner politicians in this country realize that we are inextricably linked with Africa and that our futures are inextricably linked with Africa, and our prosperity is directly linked to the prosperity of Africa, the better it is. And that's why I feel so passionately about this issue, and that's why I continue to raise these questions here in the House of Commons, because in reality, Teresa, how often do we have questions about Africa on the floor of the House? How often do we have questions about trade with Africa? No, it's all about the Middle East, it's all about China, it's all about Russia and the war in Ukraine. Admittedly, that is a huge crisis, but there are many, many things happening around the world which are taking a disproportionate amount of this government's attention. And yet, we have this giant, this absolute giant in our neighborhood, and our bilateral economic, social, political relationship is poor, I would say, to say the least.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Something key that you mentioned is moving on and creating new relationships between the UK and Africa and creating economic prosperity in those African markets. So recently, we've seen the introduction of policies such as the Development Countries Trading Scheme, which I guess mirrors some of the points which you've discussed today in terms of offering lower tariffs and also simplifying rules of origins for some African countries. I was wondering if you could give us a bit more information regarding this policy.
Well, this is something that I'm going to actually next Wednesday. We have a meeting at Lancaster House here in London where I am going for a presentation on this very subject. And we are going with the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State for International Trade, giving a presentation to a group of us MPs about this very subject. And my researcher and I will be going along to that meeting and spending the afternoon trying to get more information about that. And it will be part of my report. And of course, my appeal to you is through your podcast and the people who will be listening to it, all of those examples where an African entrepreneur or an African company is struggling to gain access, finds the paperwork difficult, finds the tariffs disproportionately high, I would be very grateful if you would ask your listeners to contact my office here in the House of Commons to give us examples of those, because what we need is direct evidence from African businesses and African entrepreneurs about some of the difficulties that they face in exporting to the United Kingdom in comparison to, for example, exporting to Brazil or America or the Middle East. That's what we're very interested in. And so I think it's going to be, as we work together going forward, and I'm obviously delighted and thrilled that you have this podcast, but going forward, I would like this not to be just a one-way system. I want this to be interactive and for us to hear from your listeners about any examples that they may have or suggestions that they would like me to forward to the government as we find out more about this scheme. And if they are based here in London, or if they have contacts here in London, please ask them to come and see me in the House of Commons. I will not turn away any African company or venture that is wanting to engage and wanting to lobby. That's my commitment to you.
Amazing. Thank you for that. I'm sure a lot of the listeners will be thrilled to hear that, and you'll probably be inundated with requests, Daniel.
Well, I won't be. My office will be inundated with. They do a very good job in helping me to deal with. I mean, obviously, we have 82,000 constituents, and each member of parliament is focused on their own constituents. But I feel so passionately about our relationship with Africa. Each member of parliament has their own particular interest. For me, changing the relationship with Africa from an economic perspective is a top priority. And that's why we're more than happy to invest the time in meeting African representatives.
Awesome. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the EU imposing higher tariffs on finished or value-added goods than it does on raw materials and produce coming from non-EU countries. And also we touched upon the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, which I guess is a move in the right direction. Do you believe more can be done?
Oh, much more can be done. We're only just scratching at the surface. And by the way, of course, interestingly, I know that some of your listeners, there will be highly polarized views about Brexit here, particularly from your listeners from within the United Kingdom. It's unfortunately a situation that tore this country apart. It was extremely polarizing. There are some friends of mine who say, how could you campaign for Brexit when Poland, the country of your birth, is within the European Union? You are creating more barriers for trade and movement of people from Poland to the United Kingdom. Why would you do that? Now, of course, you see, I'm not interested in Europe. I'm interested in the world. And when I became a member of parliament in 2005, we were exporting 53% of all goods and services were going to the European Union. Now, today, 18 years on, that figure is 37%. So it's gone down from 52% down to 37% over the last 18 years. And the trajectory is going in the same way. Why? Why? Well, it's because Europe is shrinking every single day, and it's shrunk during the course of this podcast. But Europe is shrinking every single day of every single year as a percentage of global population and as a percentage of global GDP output. We've got this huge motoring countries around the world, which are Europe is stagnating in terms of population and economy, whereas we see massive growth outside of our continent. And this year, I want you to know that the United Kingdom has been invited to join the world's largest trading organization, which is called the CPTPP, which is 14 countries in the Far East have formed a trading bloc. If your listeners Google something called CPTPP, it's Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Chile, Peru. It's all those countries in the Pacific and the Far East. They formed a free trading bloc. And would you believe they've invited the United Kingdom to join? We're going to be the only non-Pacific nation to be entering the Pacific trading bloc this year. That's a $9 trillion market. And we're entering this new trading bloc tariff-free. 99.9% of all goods and services are going to be tariff-free. That's going to create a huge renaissance of trade between Britain and Australia, Britain and Japan, and those other countries which I mentioned. That's the sort of relationship I want to get in with Africa, to create that sort of sense of minimizing the barriers to bilateral trade, minimizing the restrictions on being able to encourage the rawest, brightest African talents to come and work and contribute to the United Kingdom. We ought to be facilitating for young African entrepreneurs to be coming to the United Kingdom. I think I was saying to my Congolese friend, I think there are 52 African nations, but I've been to about 30 of them. And in my travels across Africa, I've come across some of the most brightest minds, but also some of the most extraordinary entrepreneurism that I've come across in the world. This is a melting pot of opportunity for the United Kingdom. I hope you can sense the sense of excitement in my voice.
I can, Daniel.
This is a huge opportunity for the United Kingdom and the European country, which is the first to demonstrate and to show unequivocally to Africans, this is a new relationship. We're going to put our money where our mouths are. We're not just going to talk. We're going to demonstrate to you that we are serious about tariff-free trade, and we're serious about growing bilateral trade, and we're serious about visas for students, making sure that more students, that there's greater interaction between our students and African students, and bilateral joint ventures and university exchanges and all the rest of it. That's the way to create a new relationship with Africa. And I'm up for it, and so are many of my fellow parliamentarians.
I'm certainly up for it, so it's great to hear all of this information, Daniel. You've echoed that more can be done to increase UK-Africa trade relationships or relationships in general, but what has stopped UK governments from doing more in the past?
Well, I think in the past, to be honest with you, the first thing that happened to me when I was elected as a member of parliament in 2005 is I was sent to the World Trade Organization talks in Hong Kong. And we had no voice. You know, I think I was sat at the conference between Namibia on one side in the delegation and I think Switzerland on the other. We had no voice. It was done for us by the European Union. The European Union negotiated all bilateral trade agreements on our behalf, and we had no specific say on that. Now, when you represent the disparate, highly polarized, sometimes contradictory priorities of 28 different nations, and you can imagine how different the priorities are of a country like Cyprus compared to a country like Finland. When you have such a disparate representation and you have the European Union representative negotiating on your behalf, massive compromises have to be made. Huge additional numbers of products have to be protected with high tariffs in order to comply with the demands of each of the 28 separate countries that form the European Union. Well, no more. Now that we're out of the European Union, the buck stops here, and the United Kingdom Parliament is for the first time, really in my lifetime, responsible for those free trade agreements. And we can sit down with each African partner and say, you put your cards on the table, we will put our cards on the table, and we will trade. And we will show one another what our priorities are and what we expect from each side. And do you know, when we left the European Union, we were told, you are too small and inconsequential to be able to sign bilateral free trade agreements by yourself. You need us to do that for you. And by the way, it will take you 10 years to negotiate these free trade agreements. We've actually negotiated, would you believe, 89 bilateral free trade agreements in the first year in Brexit. All 89 bilateral free trade agreements, all of which, and I'm happy to send you all the information for you to analyze independently, but all of them commensurate or slightly better than what we had through the European Union. And the Japan deal is a case in point. The Japan deal, the third largest economy in the world, the actual free trade agreement that was negotiated with Tokyo is actually independently assessed as better than the one we had through the European Union. Now, you have to ask yourself the question, how does a tiny island of 60 million people manage to negotiate trade agreements which are commensurate or slightly better than the agreements that were signed on its behalf through an artificial supranational state 7 times its size? Now, just think about that for a second.
Yes.
That's not an inconsequential statement. And I think it demonstrates the strength of the British brand and the strength of global partners wanting to engage with and trade with the United Kingdom. We're very proud of that. We're very proud of the fact that we're entering the CPTPP this year, the world's largest trading bloc. But as I say, Africa, which is on our doorstep, Africa, with whom we have so many interdependent issues, whether it's migration, whether it's climate change, whether it's prosperity, whether it's security. All of those things, we are interdependent with our African neighbors. The Africans are our closest, geographically speaking, they are our closest neighbors in the world, particularly North Africa. And the interdependence that we have with these countries is essential. And that's why the economic trade and partnership is such a key element to this.
As someone from the African diaspora, and a lot of the listeners to the podcast are from the diaspora, one thing I'm quite keen to understand is how can the UK do more to leverage the African diaspora to increase those bilateral ties between the UK and Africa?
Well, this is a critical question. And by the way, if any British citizen of African origin, whichever political party, I'm a conservative and I believe in the Conservative Party, but of any political persuasion, if any young, particularly young British citizen of African origin is interested in getting involved in politics, they must contact my office and I will sit down with them here in my office and I will talk to them about how you get involved with a political party, whether it's the Conservative Party or the Labour Party or any other party, depending on what their own political affiliations. We need a more diverse parliament. One of the best trade envoys that we've had is Adam Afriyie, who's the MP for Windsor. His office is next to mine, and he was, until recently, the trade envoy for Ghana. His family came from Ghana. I think you should interview him at once. He was the personification of an effective trade envoy. The relationship that he built with the president of Ghana, the sort of commercial links that he managed to create because of his interest and passion in Ghana. And as you know, Ghana historically has been one of our closest partners in the United Kingdom. It's an extremely important partner for us. And so what we need is more young people who of African origin, who are British citizens, who become politicians. That's, I think, one of the most important attributes. And that's another offer I give to you. If any of your listeners are British of African origin and they want to talk about politics and they're interested in politics, contact my office and I will meet with them and I will try and help. And we have many people here who mentor young people to get involved in politics. That's very, very important. But also, what more can the government do? The government can appoint more trade envoys who are dedicated to African nations and also more senior politicians. Some of the trade envoys have actually worked in the past in Buckingham Palace or as senior members of the House of Lords. We want some of our greatest, rawest talents to be appointed by the Prime Minister to focus on trade with Africa. So there's all sorts to do, but it also means getting the African diaspora involved in politics. Many other diaspora here in the United Kingdom, and I don't want to go into which ones are good and which ones are not so good. I'm not going to go down that route. But some diaspora are much more effective at working collectively across the United Kingdom to take an interest in politics, to enter politics, and then to use their positions to cement and forge bilateral relations. I started off our interview by talking about the work that I do with Poland. Instinctively, if you're a hybrid, you have this passion for promoting bilateral relations. So I think that the best thing I can start off with is by saying we need more young Britons of African origin to get involved in politics, because it's in this crucible here in the House of Commons. We have 650 members of Parliament. We are moving towards a more representative model. We are moving towards having more women. We are moving towards having more people from various different backgrounds, but we're still not there. And we're still not wholly reflecting the changing nature of British society. And so that's my appeal to you. We need to encourage more young Britons of African origin to take part in our political processes and life.
I agree, Daniel. To me, I think the African diaspora is the biggest asset that the UK has in increasing UK-Africa trade and increasing, I guess, the trade between the two. But today, what we see is China is Africa's largest single country trading partner in both, I believe, exports and imports. And we're also seeing increased interest or focus from the likes of the United States and Russia. What is the United Kingdom doing to ensure that it doesn't fall behind?
This is a real problem. Would you believe, a Congolese friend of mine said that the second largest aid budget to Congo is the British aid budget. And yet he described us as observers. Now, can you imagine how humiliating that is for me to be described as a mere observer in Africa's second largest, one of the most important nations on the continent of Africa? The Chinese and the Russians, I mean, particularly the Chinese, are hoovering up commercial contracts and opportunities. But some of the work that they do is, as I've said to you before, exploiting African people. I visited a hospital in Luanda, which had been built by a Chinese firm, where the top 7 floors of the hospital had collapsed just a year after the hospital was constructed, with poor workmanship. We talked about how certain Congolese children had been exploited by Chinese mining companies. And, you know, if the Chinese get a stranglehold on some of these countries, if you don't pay up, they seize your assets. So, for example, Entebbe, I'm sure you know, Entebbe National Airport in Uganda is now owned by China because the Ugandans failed to pay a certain loan and the Chinese seized control of Entebbe Airport. So, you know, let's not forget that the Chinese, this is a communist government where there are real human rights abuses in China. And we speak a great deal here in our parliament about our concerns as to what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghur community, ethnically genocide, what they're doing in Taiwan, what they're doing in Hong Kong, and many other human rights violations. This is a real concern. And what we need to do as a country that believes in human rights, believes in not exploiting people, and we have, I would very much hope, a higher moral and ethical standards to the way in which some of these Chinese companies operate. We need to now not just be observers, but actively incentivize British companies to enter the African market. And for far too long, I have heard the response from British companies, oh no, we couldn't possibly go to, we couldn't possibly go to Congo. It's too dangerous. They hear about some of the wars that are going on. They are fearful about projects being nationalized or all the rest of it. There's a sort of ignorance about Africa, which is breathtaking. And a lot of people seem to treat Africa as a sort of single homogeneous state. It's actually 52 of some of the most diverse, disparate, different types of countries spanning an entire continent. We need more think tanks here in London that are specializing on Africa and trade with Africa. And one of my long-term aspirations is to find sponsors to set up a really credible think tank on Africa here in London, so we can start to implement the work of educating our business community, educating young generations of Britons, that actually, rather than looking at Africa in a negative light, it is a continent with vast opportunities for British interlocutors.
You've detailed some of the negatives of African nations working with the likes of China. You touched on this slightly, but I'd like to understand in more detail what benefits or advantages do you believe the UK offers that other nations don't or can't?
Well, we are, obviously a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We're a situation peculiar to only 5 nations in the world. So we have a strong military, strong security forces. I think in this, the world is an increasingly dangerous place. And I think that bilateral cooperation in security is an important issue. Not every country in the world has that sort of military and defense capability that the United Kingdom does. We're very proud of that. But we also have some of the best universities in the world. Don't forget, Oxford and Cambridge are amongst the 2 best universities in the world. But also we have a huge interest in British education. I represent Shrewsbury, which is a beautiful constituency in Shropshire in the west of England. So profound, so much demand is there for English education that Shrewsbury School, it cannot cope with all the interest of international students. They've had to build, would you believe, a Shrewsbury School in Bangkok, and they are building one in Qatar and also in the Far East. So our education is respected around the world. Maritime law around the world is predicated on English law. There are many, would you believe, financial districts around the world that, such as the one in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai or in Kazakhstan, where they don't use their own law, they use English law. For running financial centers and districts around many jurisdictions. So the strength of our law, the strength of our language, our learning institutions, and also our military capability. We're a small nation, but we're a nation that punches above its weight. And we still stand for something in the world. And the only way that we will maintain that standing is by building and forging ever closer strategic partnerships with African nations. So it's a win-win. But we're coming and we're offering something not inconsequential in terms of an alternative perspective and narrative to what an African nation might expect from communist China.
Interesting. So you've detailed the positives of the work on the UK, and I guess throughout the conversation, one of the running themes have been in terms of how to create or develop new relationships between the UK and Africa now and going forward. So if you look at, I guess, going forward or some of the trends that we're seeing, from your perspective, what are some of the positive trends that you're seeing from your work with regards to UK-Africa trade and political relations?
Well, I think I would like to answer that question in reality. There is a great deal to do. There are some bright spots in terms of trade with certain African nations, and particularly that there has been increasing bilateral trade between Ghana and the United Kingdom and Nigeria and the United Kingdom. These are vast markets. And to reiterate the point that you made, so many Nigerians, I have so many Nigerian friends here in London who have a real thirst for trying to help and nurture the bilateral trade between Nigeria and the United Kingdom, a huge marketplace in Nigeria. But, when I visited Khartoum, for example, I was told that in the 50s and 60s, everything, nearly everything, so many consumable products that were sold in Khartoum came from the United Kingdom. Now it's next to nothing. And if you go to Khartoum today, the vast majority of imported products are Chinese. So we have, over the last few decades, we've rather been sleepwalking into becoming less and less relevant to African nations. And we've allowed the Chinese, with their Belt and Road policy, to steal a march on the United Kingdom. How do you think I felt when I visited Khartoum to be told by Sudanese politicians how the Chinese had pulled the rug from under our feet and stolen a march on us when it comes to bilateral trade? We've been very inept at focusing on Africa, and we've tended to focus on countries in the Middle East for trade, the GCC, the Far East. America, of course, is a very important trading partner, and the European Union. There's been a fixation about, and this brings me back to my earlier point, being in the European Union and having tariff-free access and having free movement of people within the European Union has created a very, very artificial narrative for British companies and investors. Why go to Africa? Why on earth would you want to go to Africa when you've got tariff-free access in the European Union and the ability to set up businesses and all the rest of it? It is this disproportionate focus on our own small continent and being part of this move towards creating an artificial supranational state with one foreign policy, one flag, one currency, and all the rest of it, which has, I would argue, disincentivized British entities from looking further beyond the shores of our own continent. Now, outside of the European Union, where we want to treat opportunities in Europe the same as we want to treat as opportunities in the Far East and Latin America and Africa, that potentially gives the next generation of British entrepreneurs an ability and an incentive to look beyond the shores of our own very, very small and shrinking continent.
Thank you for that, Daniel. You've given a very, pragmatic but candid view regarding the trends that you see between the UK and Africa. So if we look at Africa's future, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time with regards to UK-Africa trade or political relations?
Well,
or where do you hope to see it?
Yes, I haven't brought my crystal ball with me.
Where do you hope to see it?
Well, I hope to see British, and by the way, we are already working with many, although I'm not a trade envoy to an African nation, I'm still working with trade envoys who are appointed to Africa to make sure that, given my strong interest in Africa, to make sure that the work is taking place in that technology transfer offering that is going to be such a critical hook to attract attention from African politicians and African commercial entities. So what do I hope? Well, I hope that over the next 5 years, we start to demonstrate to the African nations that outside of the European Union, we are serious about massively increasing trade between our two entities and reducing tariffs to such an extent where African commercial entities are actively incentivized to think of the United Kingdom as their number one priority for trade. And that even applies to Francophone countries. Now, that would be incredible. I mean, I don't know whether we can achieve that in the next 5 years. It all depends on who's in government and just how serious are they going to be about Africa. But can you imagine a French-speaking country like Congo or Algeria, Morocco? I've spent a lot of time with the very effective Moroccan ambassador, learning of all the huge opportunities in terms of energy, solar, many different types of bilateral trade opportunities between Morocco and the United Kingdom. Morocco, a French-speaking nation, whether it's Morocco or Congo. To answer your question, within the next 5 years, for the United Kingdom to be seen, even by Francophone nations, as the go-to economic partner, that's the challenge ahead of us, and that's what we're working towards.
Awesome. That's a great vision and one I hope to see as well. Obviously, being based in the UK, I definitely would like to see more engagement and interest between the UK and Africa. Looking closer to home, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? What will Daniel be doing?
Well, I don't know, but I don't know. It's all predicated on the electorate because, of course, puts oneself up for election every 4 years, and it's in the gift of the British people who they decide to have as their elected representatives and which government is appointed. So we don't know, but we're going to have a general election, I think, in 2024. Look, I hope and expect to be working to promote Britain overseas. For me, trade is the number one priority. Foreign trade, and whether it's with Africa or whether it's with Poland, the country of my birth, I'm passionate about British exports because I see British exports, British technology transfer as massive soft power for the United Kingdom. My priority is promoting the interests of my country, the United Kingdom, internationally, globally. And I believe that the best way to do that is through a massive economic increase in economic partnerships and exports around the world. So yes, I very much hope to be in this sphere as a politician, working constructively with the government and others to increase British soft power through trade.
Brilliant. And I agree 100%. Trade is key moving forward.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or even affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Well, I've recently started to go to Mass again. I'm a Catholic.
Brilliant.
And I go every Sunday to church and I light a candle for my departed grandfather and grandmother. And I find a great solace. Politics can be a very tough arena, and there can be some terrible tensions and strains in politics.
I can imagine.
Sometimes. And, you know, your confidence can sometimes be knocked, really, in the bear pit that is politics. And we all deal with it in a different way. But I've certainly found going to church every Sunday a real comfort, because I think if you can take just an hour of your time every week, not thinking about yourself, not thinking about your job, not thinking about all the problems that you have, but invest that 1 hour a week in your relationship with the Almighty, it gives you a tremendous succor and comfort.
Fantastic. I agree 100%. It's good to be selfless, find that solitude, that place of togetherness and peace.
But also, we talk about it, and the greatest personal pleasure that I've had as the Member of Parliament for 17 years is when you are actively helping somebody. And as a Member of Parliament, of course, you do have the power to be able to use House of Commons paper to write to the authorities if you feel somebody is being discriminated against or somebody is suffering in a particular way which is not commensurate with their rights as a citizen or as an individual. So yes, as a Member of Parliament, you have a certain ability to help people. And I take great pride. I've had the same secretary for, would you believe, 18 years.
Amazing.
I couldn't have done this job without her.
She must enjoy working for you.
Well, I mean, I tell you, she's very patient. She's very patient and she's very tolerant. But she has been with me for 18 years. And what she does in terms of, you know, we get telephone calls from people about their concerns about child tax credits, CSA payments, housing benefits, pensions, all sorts of things. Terrible difficulties during the pandemic. She is worth her weight in gold, and I couldn't have done this job without her. I would have fallen over if it wasn't for her. And of course, we get a lot of satisfaction in being able to help people. But even as an individual, I mean, to answer your question, it's the time when you go out of your way to help somebody who is in need that really the greatest benefits somehow land on you. Do you see what I mean?
100%. I couldn't have thought of a better way to close today's conversation. That's a beautiful and profound note to end on. But before we go, do you have any closing remarks, any final calls to action for people who are interested in UK-Africa trade, UK politics, the work that you do?
Well, I would just end by saying thank you very much. I just wish that, I would end by saying this. I just wish that the BBC and Sky News were as effective as you are in terms of allowing a politician to get his message across rather than trying to have a confrontational diatribe with them.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for that, Daniel.
Thank you, Tersa. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you, and I look forward to sending you my report on trade with Africa when it's completed by the end of March.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for taking your time out. I know you're extremely busy.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to have over an hour of your time. Extremely insightful discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. As an international trade professional myself, it's been enjoyable discussing all aspects of UK-Africa trade. So once again, thank you for your time and look forward to further discussions and collaborations.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.